It begins not with a shout, but with a whisper in the halls of medicine, in the smoke-thick air of Vienna's dimly lit parlors, in the cracked voice of a trembling patient lying on a couch, clutching memories like broken glass. The year is 1896. The man sitting across from her is Sigmund Freud. Not yet the icon carved into the marble halls of psychology, not yet the father of psychoanalysis. He is young, intense, ambitious, and terrified because something isn't adding up. Over months of listening, he begins to hear the same story again and again, told by different people from different walks of life, yet all echoing the same hollow truth. It happened when I was a child. He was my father. No one believed me. These aren't the fantasies of hysterical minds. They are confessions, whispered through shame, trauma, and trembling lips. They speak of violation, betrayal, abuse, not imagined, but remembered. The pattern is too consistent, the details too raw, and Freud begins to see it. Not a fluke, but a structure, a pattern, a social epidemic hiding in plain sight. He calls it the seduction theory. Freud dares to write it down, that the hysteria and neuroses manifesting in his patients were not the result of repressed wishes or symbolic dreams, but the psychic scars of real childhood sexual abuse, most often at the hands of the male family members, fathers, brothers, uncles. It's a theory that doesn't just whisper in the dark, it screams at the foundation of society, because if Freud is right, then the rot runs through the family, through patriarchy, through the church, the school, the home. It points a trembling finger at the fathers of the respectable bourgeois world, the very men who fund his career, fill his lectures, and run the institutions he hopes to join. And then, almost as suddenly as he raises it, Freud retracts it. He claims he was mistaken, that the memories were not real events, but fantasies, that the women and men were not victims, but confused, delusional, even deceptive. He pivots. Instead of trauma, he focuses on desire. Instead of violation, repression. And with that, psychoanalysis is born not as a tool of liberation, but as a theory built upon silence. Why? Did Freud suppress the most damning truth about society to protect the very structure that empowered him? Or was he protecting himself from exile, from disbelief, from losing everything in a world not ready to hear what he had uncovered? This is not just about Freud. It's about the moment when truth becomes too dangerous to speak, when evidence is buried, not because it is false, but because it is intolerably real. And it is about what happens to a civilization when its deepest wounds are rebranded as dreams, and the victim becomes the unreliable narrator of her own life. The whisper remains, unheard, unhealed, and so we begin, not with answers, but with the question, what happens when the most dangerous truths are the ones we refuse to believe? The years between 1894 and 1897 were the most radical, and perhaps the most honest, period of Sigmund Freud's career. He wasn't yet a legend. He wasn't yet surrounded by disciples, nor embalmed in textbooks. He was still experimenting, listening closely, cataloging human pain with the curiosity of a scientist and the sensitivity of a poet. And during this brief window, Freud stumbled across something so disturbing, so corrosive to the social fabric, that it would soon be buried, not by accident, but by necessity. His patients came from all walks of life, women from respectable households, men plagued by inner chaos. Their symptoms varied: paralysis, anxiety, compulsions, and chronic fear. But again and again, as Freud listened, he heard the same unbearable confessions. The stories were not foggy or symbolic. They were not abstract dreams, filled with fathers turning into wolves, or staircases that hinted at desire. They were explicit, direct, consistent, vivid. Something happened to them. As children, they spoke of being touched, violated, manipulated, most often by older men, not strangers, but family, fathers, uncles, tutors, priests, sometimes brothers. The perpetrators were always figures of trust, pillars of respectability, and in a society where male authority was unquestioned, this placed the burden and the shame solely on the victims. Freud began to notice a pattern. These traumas weren't isolated or rare. They were widespread, systemic, and he began to theorize that the root of hysteria, the mysterious illness that had puzzled doctors for centuries, was not some inherited flaw, not female weakness, not unconscious fantasy. It was memory, buried trauma, repressed pain from childhood sexual abuse that the mind, unable to face, had locked away in the unconscious. He called it the seduction theory. In his early papers, Freud didn't soften the blow. He described the mechanism with clinical clarity. A child, sexually violated by someone they trusted, experiences confusion and fear. The psyche, overwhelmed, cannot integrate the experience. It pushes it down, represses it, but the trauma doesn't disappear. It festers. Years later, it returns as neurosis, as hysteria, as a scream the conscious mind no longer understands. Freud believed he had found the smoking gun. He presented his findings in lectures. He wrote essays, and the medical community, overwhelmingly male, deeply invested in the status quo, reacted with silence, discomfort, and hostility, because this theory didn't merely suggest that abuse occurred. It implied that the very structure of civilized society was built atop the silence of its victims, that the domestic sphere, the bourgeois family, the sacred paternal bond, was not safe, but the hidden battleground of psychological collapse. Imagine the implications. If Freud was right, then the respected father at the dinner table could also be the architect of his daughter's madness. The reverend, the teacher, the politician. These were not symbols of order and morality. They were suspects, and the hysteria dismissed as feminine weakness was, in truth, the echo of real horror. Freud stood at a crossroads. The evidence pointed in one direction, but the path was lined with fire. Colleagues began distancing themselves. Funding grew scarce. His ideas were ridiculed. He was warned, subtly and directly, that such theories were not just professionally dangerous, but socially irresponsible. They could incite panic, destabilize families, tear down the credibility of men who held the reins of power. He faced a moral war. On one side, the unflinching pursuit of truth. On the other, the immense pressure to conform, to survive, to be accepted, and then he recanted. In 1897, Freud abruptly declared that the seduction theory had been a mistake, that his patients had not been recalling actual events, but childhood fantasies, that the unconscious mind, driven by forbidden desires, had invented these stories. What was once memory became metaphor. What was trauma became wish. The pivot was seismic. In doing so, Freud laid the groundwork for modern psychoanalysis, not as a tool to uncover repressed crimes, but to analyze inner conflict, the symbolic realm of dreams and desires. It was more palatable, less politically volatile, and most importantly, it absolved the powerful. The victim became the unreliable narrator. The perpetrator disappeared into the fog of metaphor, and society could breathe easy again. But did Freud truly change his mind? Or was he, like so many before and after him, coerced by the invisible hand of power, nudged into rewriting reality to keep the machinery of civilization intact? It's tempting to say he betrayed the truth, that he sold out. But the story is more complex. Freud lived in a world where going too far could cost everything: reputation, career, safety. He knew that confronting such a damning reality would not only destroy his standing, it would make him an enemy of the very culture he hoped to influence. And maybe, he thought, if he compromised now, he could return to the truth later, when the world was ready. But history doesn't always offer second chances. The seduction theory was buried, the papers remained, but the mainstream doctrine shifted. And with that shift, a veil was drawn over a wound too deep, too scandalous, too threatening to name. And so, the question lingers: was the seduction theory a delusion? The flawed thinking of a young man who misread his patients? Or was it the brief moment when the veil lifted and we glimpsed a truth so uncomfortable that even its discoverer turned away? And if so, what else have we silenced to protect the illusion of order? The answers remain locked in the unconscious, not just of individuals, but of entire civilizations, waiting. In 1897, Sigmund Freud did something that would alter the course of modern psychology and silence the voices of countless victims for over a century. He retracted the seduction theory. With a stroke of intellectual reversal, Freud publicly abandoned his radical claim that childhood sexual trauma was the root of neurosis. No longer were the confessions of his patients considered evidence. No longer were the symptoms of hysteria seen as the echo of buried abuse. Instead, Freud now insisted that these memories were not memories at all, but fantasies, unconscious desires, repressed wishes, psychic projections. According to his new theory, the young girl who spoke of being violated by her father was not recalling a real event. She was unconsciously expressing the Oedipus complex, a supposed universal desire for the father, later rejected and disguised as abuse. What was once horror became metaphor, and the reality of trauma was replaced with the poetry of myth. For many, this shift marked the birth of modern psychoanalysis. But for others, it marked a betrayal, not just of Freud's patients, but of truth itself. In private, Freud's letters to his close friend Wilhelm Fliess reveal the deep inner conflict behind his retraction. He admits to being overwhelmed by the implications of what he had uncovered. He confesses his fear that his theory would be rejected by the scientific community. And most hauntingly, he writes, "I no longer believe in my neurotica, but doubt is not the same as disproof, and fear is not the same as error. So why did he turn away? The pressures were immense." Freud was isolated. His peers dismissed his findings with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The idea that fathers, the patriarchal cornerstone of society, could be responsible for the psychic collapse of their children was not just taboo, it was unthinkable. To affirm the seduction theory would be to indict the very class of men who defined what was respectable, rational, and moral. Freud was trying to build a career in a world run by those men, their money-funded institutions. Their approval legitimized ideas. Their silence guarded the walls of society. To speak the truth would have been to burn every bridge, exile himself from every circle of influence, and take up arms against the most powerful forces of his time. So Freud chose survival, and in choosing survival, he transformed his discipline into something palatable, something safe. He offered a theory of the mind that preserved the status quo, that reinterpreted the victim as the fantasist, and recast abuse as symbolic longing. In doing so, he gave the world a model of the psyche that would dominate the 20th century. But at what cost? This wasn't just a scientific pivot. It was a philosophical turning point. The retraction institutionalized doubt. It taught generations of psychologists to question the reliability of trauma. It placed the burden of proof not on the abuser, but on the abused, and it gave society the perfect intellectual justification to ignore, minimize, and rationalize stories too horrifying to confront. The damage rippled outward. Feminist critics would later accuse Freud of enshrining patriarchy within the architecture of the unconscious. Instead of challenging the power structures that perpetuate abuse, psychoanalysis began to interpret pain through the lens of internal conflict rather than external violation. Jeffrey Masson, a former director of the Freud Archives, would ignite a firestorm in the 1980s by claiming that Freud knew the truth and buried it. Masson argued that Freud's retraction wasn't just an academic mistake, but an act of cowardice, an abandonment of his patients, a betrayal of those whose stories had already been silenced by their families, by their cultures, by the shame that follows survivors wherever they go. To understand the weight of Freud's decision, we must ask, what happens when a society's leading psychologist tells us not to believe the voices of the wounded? What happens when trauma is translated into myth? When memory becomes suspect? When pain is rebranded as fantasy? For many survivors, it means being doubly exiled, first by their abuser, and then by the very system meant to understand them. It means living with a truth that the world refuses to hear. It means suffering in a reality labeled delusion. Freud was not a villain. He was a man, a brilliant, flawed, conflicted man, caught between the revelation of a dark truth and the crushing weight of societal denial. But that doesn't absolve the consequences, because in retreating from the seduction theory, Freud didn't just rewrite his own legacy. He helped construct a psychological model that pathologized the victim and protected the perpetrator, a model that has, in subtle and overt ways, infected how we talk about abuse, memory, and truth itself. Even today, victims are often asked, "Are you sure? Could it have been a dream? Maybe you misunderstood." The ghost of Freud's retraction still lingers in the language we use, in the skepticism we carry, in the systems that demand certainty from the wounded, while giving the powerful every benefit of doubt. And so, we are left with the uncomfortable question: was Freud's retraction a necessary compromise? The price of preserving a fragile career in a hostile world? Or was it the moment when the pursuit of truth was exchanged for the illusion of respectability? Either way, it was a turning point. And for those who lived in the silence that followed, a generation of patients whose pain was reframed, minimized, and explained away, it was more than a retraction. It was a betrayal. What drives a man to turn away from a truth he once believed? What makes a society, armed with knowledge, evidence, and voices crying out in pain, choose silence? To understand Freud's retraction is to confront something older than psychoanalysis itself, a force not just within him, but within all of us. Denial, not ignorance, not confusion, but the willful decision to not see what is in front of us, because to truly see would change everything. Freud's turn away from the seduction theory wasn't just a personal crisis. It was a reflection of something deeper, an ancient reflex of the human mind, a defense mechanism baked into our psychology. Denial is not just avoidance, it is survival. In the shadow of unbearable truths, the mind protects itself through repression, through rationalization, through the careful construction of illusions. Repression, as Freud himself defined it, is the act of pushing intolerable thoughts out of consciousness. But what happens when the intolerable isn't just internal conflict, but external reality? It becomes easier to doubt the witness than to accept the crime, easier to question the memory than to confront the fact. Denial, then, becomes a social contract, an unspoken agreement that we will all look away together. Social psychologist Leon Festinger called it cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when confronted with contradictory beliefs or evidence. If the world tells us that parents are protectors, but we see signs that some are predators, our minds bend to protect the narrative, because to accept the contradiction would mean tearing down the stories we've built our lives around. This is why Freud's original theory was so dangerous. It wasn't just about trauma, it was about power, about patriarchy, about the moral foundations of society. To admit that fathers could be the source of madness was to strip away the comforting fiction of the family as a sacred, safe space. Freud's retraction restored the illusion, and illusions are the glue of civilization. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most disturbing experiments in social psychology. Participants, believing they were delivering electric shocks to another person, continued to obey authority figures even as the screams of the victim grew louder. 2/3 went all the way to the maximum voltage. The lesson: people will commit or ignore harm, not because they are evil, but because they are obedient, conditioned, incapable of challenging the hierarchy when someone in a white coat tells them it's okay. Power doesn't just dominate through violence, it dominates through suggestion, through conformity. A decade later, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly ordinary people can internalize roles. Guards became sadistic, prisoners became broken, and the experiment spiraled into chaos, not because of any external command, but because of what people were willing to become when systems allowed them. The truth is, we all want to believe we're good, that our institutions are good, that our parents, priests, presidents, and professors are protectors. So when reality cracks that image, denial rushes in like a flood. Irving Janis called it groupthink, the phenomenon where members of a group suppress dissenting opinions in order to maintain harmony. Dissent becomes dangerous. Silence becomes virtue, and entire institutions become factories of mutual denial. This isn't just theory. We've seen it play out in our own time, again and again. In the Catholic Church, decades of abuse were buried by bishops and cardinals who claimed moral authority while shielding predators. Survivors were silenced, documents destroyed, the illusion of holiness preserved at the cost of countless lives. In Hollywood, for years, whispers about powerful producers abusing women were dismissed as rumors. Actresses were blacklisted, journalists were intimidated, and the machinery of fame rolled on, greased with fear and denial. The pattern is always the same. Someone speaks out. They are met with doubt, disbelief, sometimes ridicule, because acknowledging their truth would mean confronting what we've allowed, what we've ignored, what we've enabled. We don't see because we don't want to see. Willful blindness is the refusal to acknowledge facts that are right in front of us, not because they are hidden, but because they are too disruptive, too painful, too inconvenient. Freud's patients were not metaphorical. Their stories were not allegories. They were real, raw accounts of suffering, but acknowledging them would have shattered the professional, social, and cultural order that Freud hoped to navigate. So he reinterpreted them: subconscious desires, childish fantasies, myths. The problem wasn't that the truth was too complex. The problem was that it was too simple. Children were being abused, and society didn't want to know. Today, we see the same dynamics play out on screens, in institutions, in boardrooms, in classrooms, and in homes. Survivors are still met with suspicion, still asked to prove, to recall, to relive, because truth alone is not enough. It has to be accepted, and acceptance threatens the system. But here's the paradox. Denial may preserve the illusion of peace, but it guarantees the continuity of pain. What is repressed doesn't disappear. It festers, it mutates, it returns through symptoms, through dysfunction, through new generations inheriting the silence. Freud faced a choice, and so do we. Do we uphold the myths that make us feel safe, or do we confront the truths that might set us free? The mind, like society, seeks equilibrium, but sometimes equilibrium is just a well-dressed lie. The real work, psychological, cultural, moral, is not in maintaining balance, but in tipping it, in daring to believe the unbelievable, in listening when it's easier to forget, Because denial is not neutral, it is complicity wrapped in comfort. And history shows us what we refuse to see doesn't vanish. It waits. It grows. It returns. A shift occurred the moment Freud stepped away from the edge of the abyss. When he replaced the terrifying clarity of the seduction theory with the murky waters of fantasy and repressed desire, he didn't just alter the direction of psychoanalysis. He handed society a powerful script, one that could be rehearsed, refined, and repeated for over a century. The new story was simple. If someone claims abuse, they are confused. If their story is inconsistent, they must be delusional. If their trauma doesn't fit our expectations, it's probably symbolic. What began as an internal theory of the mind became an external apparatus of doubt, a mechanism not for healing, but for silencing. This was the birth of institutional gaslighting. It was subtle at first, an academic nuance, a clinical reframe, but its implications were seismic. The idea that trauma might not be real, but a fabrication of desire or fantasy, gave power a way out. It offered predators the perfect alibi and handed institutions a script to dismiss, discredit, and delay. The term hysteria became the catch-all for what couldn't be explained, or more accurately, what society didn't want to explain. Women who spoke out were labeled unstable, over-emotional, disordered. The word itself, hysteria, derived from hystera, the Greek word for womb. It pathologized femininity. It rewrote anguish into irrationality. And so, behind locked hospital doors, women were institutionalized, not for madness, but for memory. The pattern repeated itself through generations. In the 1980s and 90s, as survivors of childhood abuse began to speak up in greater numbers, a new term was introduced into the cultural bloodstream: false memory syndrome, coined not by psychologists, but by a self-interested group of accused parents. The so-called False Memory Syndrome Foundation launched a media campaign that painted all recovered memories as inherently suspect. This wasn't science, it was strategy. The goal was never to understand trauma, it was to neutralize it. Legal systems quickly adopted the narrative. Judges and juries began to view abuse claims through the lens of doubt. Was the victim suggestible? Was the memory recovered in therapy? Could the accusation be part of a fantasy, a projection, a confusion? It didn't matter how consistent the stories were, or how much pain was visible in the eyes of the survivors. The mere presence of emotion became a reason for disbelief. Crying too much? You're unstable. Not crying at all? You're cold and manipulative. The institution didn't need to disprove you. It only needed to doubt you. Hollywood played its part with devastating precision. In films and television, the unreliable woman became a trope. The gaslighted wife, the delusional daughter, the manipulative accuser. Story after story conditioned us to expect deception behind every female breakdown. We began to associate trauma not with truth, but with instability. Movies like Gone Girl and Girl Interrupted didn't just entertain. They educated us subtly on who to believe and who to suspect. They trained an entire generation to equate distress with duplicity. And it didn't stop there. Psychiatry, once envisioned as a tool for liberation, often became a system of containment. Diagnoses like borderline personality disorder, conversion disorder, and somatization have been disproportionately applied to women, particularly those who report trauma that can't be cleanly documented. In many cases, trauma becomes the very reason their testimony is discredited. It's a perfect paradox. You're too damaged to be trusted, too emotional to be rational, too hurt to be believed. And through it all, the structures of power remain untouched. Institutions thrive not by resolving trauma, but by redirecting its narrative. Gaslighting, at its core, is a survival strategy, not for the individual, but for the system. It protects the status quo by ensuring the truth never becomes consensus. But here's the thing. Gaslighting doesn't need to be personal. It can be cultural, it can be procedural, it can be medical, legal, cinematic. It's not just the abuser whispering. You're imagining things. It's the courtroom that demands an impossible level of proof. The psychiatrist who rewrites pain into pathology. The media that casts victims as villains. When Freud reinterpreted the cries of his patients as fantasy, he laid the groundwork for all of this, not because he was evil, but because he was afraid. Afraid of what the truth would cost. Afraid of who he'd lose. Afraid of what doors it would open. But that fear created a precedent. A world where symbolic interpretations carry more weight than lived experience. A world where trauma is a puzzle to decode rather than a wound to witness. A world where saying it happened is less credible than saying you imagined it. The institutionalization of gaslighting is not a glitch in the system. It is the system, a society that rewards comfort over confrontation, myth over memory, and order over justice, will always choose denial, wrapped in sophistication, framed in science, and signed with a stamp of authority. But no system can suppress truth forever. It seeps through the cracks. It shows up in the whispered confessions, the trembling hands, the eyes that have seen too much. And when enough people recognize the pattern, the illusion begins to break. Gaslighting only works when you're the only one in the dark. The moment someone says, "I see it too," the power shifts, and that moment is coming. A century has passed, but the echo still lingers. It hums beneath courtrooms, boardrooms, hospital corridors, and therapy sessions. It is the ghost of a retracted truth, the voice of a theory once spoken, then buried. And though Freud himself is long gone, the consequences of that single decision, the choice to disbelieve, ripple through our world like aftershocks of an earthquake no one dared to name. We now live in a time saturated with trauma, not because suffering is new, but because the silence around it is finally cracking. And yet, even now, when a survivor speaks, the response is rarely belief. It is suspicion. It is discomfort. It is the same question Freud began asking the moment he turned his back on the seduction theory. Could this really have happened? In the wake of the Dr. Me Too movement, that question resurfaced on a global scale. Millions of women and men stepped forward, sharing stories that had been locked in shame for decades. Stories of abuse, coercion, manipulation, and betrayal. The pattern was unmistakable. The silence had been systemic, the cover-ups coordinated, the power dynamic glaring. But as quickly as these truths surfaced, the backlash arrived. The accused became the victims. The survivors became attention seekers. Reputations mattered more than justice, and Freud's ghost reappeared, not in a therapist's office, but in headlines, think pieces, and televised debates. Was she exaggerating? Was he seeking revenge? Were they just imagining it? The language of denial was dusted off and modernized. Now it spoke in the dialect of public relations, legal settlements, and social media outrage, but the structure was the same. Distrust the wounded, protect the powerful. We began to see the rebranding of trauma as performance, a kind of narcissism, a cry for attention. Suddenly, telling the truth about your pain was seen as suspect. Too raw and you're unstable, too composed and you're cold. Once again, victims were caught in an impossible bind: suffer silently or speak and be disbelieved. And all of it, quietly, invisibly, traced back to a decision made in 1897, a moment when one man, terrified of the implications, decided it was safer to view trauma as fantasy than to confront the architecture of abuse. That shift from reality to metaphor didn't just alter the history of psychology, it gave society a way out, a justification, a mask. And it's a mask we still wear today, even within the therapeutic world, where healing is meant to take place. The residue of Freud's retraction is visible. Survivors often encounter frameworks that analyze their suffering as dysfunction rather than injustice. The emphasis is placed on their reaction, not on what caused it. Terms like emotional dysregulation, attachment disorder, and maladaptive coping are offered, not as dismissals, but as explanations. But what if the coping isn't the illness? What if it's the evidence? A growing number of trauma-informed therapists and scholars are pushing back. They argue that much of what is pathologized as disorder is, in fact, a rational response to intolerable reality, that the body remembers what society refuses to. Still, the dominant culture resists, because acknowledging the pervasiveness of abuse doesn't just challenge our institutions, it threatens the myths we live by. We want to believe that families are safe, that leaders are noble, that society protects the innocent. These beliefs are not trivial. They are foundational. They create the illusion of order, and when a survivor's story exposes the cracks in that illusion, it becomes easier to dismiss the story than to rebuild the foundation. This is not just psychological resistance, it's cultural defense, and the therapeutic industry, like any other, is not immune to market forces. There is more funding, more prestige, and more professional safety in treating symptoms than in confronting causes. You can prescribe for anxiety, you can bill for depression, but what pill do you offer for betrayal? What diagnosis accounts for having your truth systematically erased? Even in academia, the tendency persists. When scholars critique Freud's retraction, they are often seen as fringe, disruptive, or overly political. The canon resists revision. The ghost must remain untouchable. But what if, just for a moment, we allow ourselves to ask the forbidden question? What if Freud had stood by the seduction theory? What if, in 1897, the medical community had accepted that childhood sexual abuse was not rare fantasy, but widespread reality? Would institutions have been forced to reckon with their own complicity? Would legal systems have evolved to believe victims rather than break them? Would our collective understanding of trauma be rooted in validation rather than suspicion? Imagine a world where truth was not pathologized, where the first response to a cry for help was belief, not analysis, where the wounded were trusted, not dissected. That world is not impossible, but it was delayed. Delayed by a decision to retreat from the truth, a decision made in fear, a decision that haunts us still. And so, we arrive at a crossroads. The ghost of Freud's retraction still walks among us, not to be condemned, but to be confronted, because until we name the harm, we cannot heal from it. Until we trust the wounded, we cannot rebuild what was broken. And until we replace silence with solidarity, metaphor with memory, denial with acknowledgement, the truth will remain a whisper. But maybe, just maybe, that whisper is growing louder. Every civilization tells itself a story about who we are, what we value, what we protect. But some stories aren't written in books or taught in schools. They are buried, passed over in silence, encoded in the subtle ways we look away. Not because we don't know, but because knowing would require change. Because truth, when it threatens the foundation, is treated like a threat. And so, we lie, not always with words, sometimes with diagnosis, sometimes with distraction, sometimes with myth. Freud was not the first to glimpse the horror behind the curtain, but he was the first to give it a language powerful enough to shake the world. Between 1894 and 1897, he stood on the edge of an unthinkable truth: that the human mind fractures under the weight of real, lived abuse, that children do not invent stories of sexual trauma, that the origins of madness are not mysterious, but often mundane and monstrous. But then he blinked. He stepped back, and the world exhaled, because to accept his original theory would have required something civilization wasn't prepared to give: accountability. It would have meant admitting that the very institutions we revere, the family, the church, the school, the clinic, are not always sanctuaries, that the father, the priest, the teacher, the doctor, the revered patriarch, could be the source of devastation. That truth was too costly, too destabilizing. So, the story was rewritten. Trauma became fantasy. Pain became neurosis. Victims became unreliable. And from that pivot, a new narrative was born. The lie didn't scream. It whispered. It wrapped itself in the language of science, respectability, tradition. It shaped legal systems, therapeutic models, cultural scripts. It turned the question, "What happened to you?" into "What's wrong with you?" And slowly, we built a house on that lie, a house where children who cried out were told they misunderstood, where women who spoke up were labeled hysterical, where the powerful were protected and the wounded were pathologized. That house became our society, and yet something in us remembers, even if the conscious mind forgets. The body does not. Repression, as Freud once described, is not disappearance, it is burial. But what is buried does not die. It waits. It mutates. It echoes through generations as anxiety, addiction, disconnection, rage. If trauma is the wound, repression is the scar tissue, thick, numbing, protective. But scar tissue doesn't breathe. It doesn't feel. It doesn't heal. And so, the culture becomes a body in chronic pain, unable to name the injury, condemned to treat symptoms while ignoring cause. The cost of denial is not just personal, it's civilizational. We tell ourselves we are rational, that we value truth, but we forget that societies, like individuals, protect themselves through dissociation. We compartmentalize. We forget what's too painful to hold. We invent religions, ideologies, diagnoses, distractions, all to avoid the unbearable truth that the hurt we see in the world was not born of chaos, but of choices, that silence is never neutral, that we were warned and we turned away. Freud did not start as a villain. He was, at first, a heretic, a man who listened, who wrote in his early letters that the stories of his patients could not be dismissed, that their terror was real, that their suffering had cause. But in time, he became the very thing he was escaping, a gatekeeper of the status quo. He chose survival over revolution, acceptance over confrontation, and in that decision, he showed us a terrifying possibility, that even brilliance can buckle, that even the most daring minds can retreat when the abyss stares back, that cowardice is not rare, it is human, but that doesn't absolve us. If anything, it warns us, because now the burden is ours, to revisit the story, to look again at what was denied, to ask not whether Freud failed, but whether we are still failing. Every diary hidden in a drawer, every testimony ignored in a courtroom, every child silenced at the dinner table, every victim gaslit in therapy. These are not isolated incidents. They are the architecture of our denial. We've learned to speak about trauma, but only within limits. We accept it in documentaries, but not in dinner conversations. We post hashtags, but hesitate to confront the perpetrators in our own circles. We want healing, but not the confrontation it requires. We want redemption without reckoning, but the reckoning will come. It always does. It arrives in waves, in movements, in exposés, in the whispered courage of those who refuse to forget, in therapists who listen, in teachers who believe, in systems that slowly begin to shift. And in those moments, the lie begins to crack, because the truth was never destroyed, only silenced. Alice Miller once wrote, "The truth about our childhood is stored up in our body, and although we can repress it, we can never alter it. Our intellect can be deceived, our feelings manipulated, our perceptions confused, and our body tricked with medication. But someday, the body will present its bill. We are living in that someday. The question is no longer what happened. It is, what else have we refused to see? What other truths have we buried because they endangered our comfort? What would it mean to unbuild the house, to strip away the denial, to sit in the discomfort, to name what was once unspeakable? Maybe then we would build something better, not perfect, but honest. A house where children are believed, where silence is not safety, where trauma is not a metaphor, where truth is not feared. It starts as it always has, with listening and choosing not to look away.